I want to turn your attention this morning over to the book of Romans. Some time back, we had dealt with Romans 12, verse 1, and the issues of our body, but I want to continue moving on here just a little bit to the next couple of verses, and we'll just read those first three verses together this morning. Romans chapter 12 and verse number 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. There's plenty wrapped up in those two verses, several verses there, those three verses that we just read to you, but especially we think of verses 1 and 2. There's so much wrapped up there we could focus on, but I've had on my mind in just the last little while the importance of dealing with the mind, our minds. And you notice there in verse number 2, it says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then in verse number 3, think soberly. And so this morning I want to deal with this issue a little bit of renewing the mind. Every one of us has the challenge in our minds to think and of course, eventually to be what we ought to. And maybe a little bit sort of a comparison or a companion, a little limerick to Benjamin Franklin's thing about the horse being lost because of the want of a nail. But this one goes like this. It's by Frank Outlaw, and he gave this equation. He said, watch your thoughts, they become words. Watch your words, they become actions. Watch your actions, they become habits. Watch your habits, they become character. And then finally, watch your character, it becomes your destiny. It all sort of begins, going back again to the little one from Benjamin Franklin, just a little nail. It's just something minor. And yet it works its way all the way up until finally the horse is lost. And in our equation here today, just a little thought. But that thought can lead us to a ruined destiny. You see, really, just to be honest about it, our temptations and our choice to go with God begins in our mind. And we need to really recognize that God wants us to have a renewed mind. And yet for probably all of us, I guess, it's just probably part of the human condition. For every one of us, our thoughts are what the problem is. It's what I allow myself to think on. Or if it's not just even, meditating on something, it may be just what I choose in my mind, what seems appealing in my mind. And of course, it mentions here at the beginning of verse number 2, be not conformed to this world. And so we recognize that the idea is the worldly mindset, what this world around us would like to be involved in and what seems appealing to them is that thing we have to resist and allow God to renew our mind, really transform our mind so that we can be what He wants us to be. We can think in the way that He wants us to think. Again, we noticed the bodily side a number of weeks ago now, maybe a couple months ago maybe, that we present our bodies a living sacrifice. But today I'd like to suggest that we must present our minds a living sacrifice as well. Again, a key part of this battle is the battle of the mind. And really, again, there's two sides of the conflict. Either we will allow God to transform our minds and renew them and help us to prove and live out the perfect will of God, or we will allow the world to shape our mindset, and we may well do those things that the world would suggest. Now, This is a challenging subject. And most of us probably have, at least at one time or another, dealt with several things in our minds. Now, I'm going to get to some of how that applies, because sometimes we can very quickly move off into one lane or another in this issue of our mind. And so it may be impure thoughts, or it may be some other mindset that we would have as to, well, how does this apply? But there's a variety of things, and Jesus dealt with them over in Matthew chapter 5. We're going to get to them in just a little bit. But I want us to just pause for a moment and kind of get a mental picture. I was actually, I think maybe it might have even been about the middle of the night, and it seemed like God was kind of helping me or speaking to me in this area of our mind. And even sometimes that the mindset can affect our loyalties and various other things that are involved there. So going back to our trip to Florida, we were down there for a week and a half or whatever, and Stephanie wanted to go out kayaking, and so we went to a nearby park there, and they have a river. I think it ends up going off into the ocean there, but we went on up river on these kayaks. She and Darren were on one, and I had another one. And we just paddled along, no big deal, except that I knew that there could be some alligators in that area. And in fact, there were. That was just the nature of it, that there were. And I didn't really mind if I saw some like this. But I didn't exactly want to have a, 12-foot gator coming after my kayak. And maybe that's not likely, but it still was on my mind. And so as I was paddling along, I kept watching. I'd be looking around in the water, wanting to make sure that there wasn't any alligator that was sneaking up on me or whatever. I don't know. Maybe that's again a silly mental thing. But we worked our way back through, and finally there was a little, I don't know really what you'd call it, but a little cove sort of, but it kind of went back into a smaller stream, and we worked our way back around. Finally we came to a little place, kind of a narrow place. We could have turned around there. It was a tree that kind of gone across the creek there. By that time it's not, well, a little bit wider maybe than the pulpit, but it wasn't really very wide here, or the platform, I mean. Wasn't very wide. It would have been a little bit wider than that. Maybe as wide as the church here. And we've just kind of worked our way back through. Well, toward the end, it was narrower, I guess. And so I slipped around the tree there a little bit, it kind of blocking the way, but I slipped around it and I started working my way back through. But I kept my eyes open. And after a little bit, I'm working my way back through, and I look, and right there on the bank, there's a scaly tail. And I looked a little closer, and there's a large body. And we're not talking about a gator that's like this. We're talking about a gator that probably is not quite as, well, yeah, that'd be exaggerated, but probably 10 to 12 feet long. Big enough to kind of do some damage, perhaps. And I alerted the others, and I turned the kayak around. Yeah, I wanted to get a picture of it. I can show it to you if you want to see that. But I wanted to be ready to get out of there. Why is that? Well, again, maybe that gator would have done nothing to us. It kind of moved around a little bit, but I don't know if it was just resting, sunning itself, or just what. But it wasn't aggressive that I could tell. But I turned my kayak around, I backed it up there so I could get a picture, but I was ready to get out of there in a hurry if I had to. Again, why is that? Well, because of a little bit of what gators can do. You recognize, I think their bite is somewhere on par, at least, with a great white shark as far as the pounds per square inch. I think it's about 3,700 pounds per square inch that they figure Now, I'm not sure the differences between an alligator and a crocodile. Maybe it's the crocodile that has the 3,700. I'm not sure about the alligator, but it's enough to make you wonder. And as I've kind of learned a little bit about gators or read about them through the years, it sounds like they'll grab the prey and with that firm grip will take it down underwater and drown it and then maybe take it off to a lair somewhere and eat it as they, in spurts or whatever, as they need to. The other thing is, if you can get away, that bite somehow grabs you, but you can fight it off and you get away, the infection is very, very serious because of all the bacteria or whatever that are in those teeth or on those teeth. And so the bite itself, even if you can get away and are not drowned, the bite itself is enough to work its way through your system until you are in serious trouble. And it seemed as though God was kind of helping me to recognize that our thoughts can be that way as well. You see, sometimes our thoughts can lead to actions that will quickly damn our soul. But sometimes our thoughts may just begin a bit of an infection in our soul that begins to destroy us. So that we ought to, maybe a little bit, if I could compare it this way, we ought to be handling our thoughts like I handled the thought of alligators in that river that we were kayaking along. I kept my eyes out. I was watching, staying ready. Now, obviously, there are some times that you may be tripped up a little bit with your thoughts because it is so easy to happen before you realize, oh, wait a minute, what am I thinking? I shouldn't be dwelling on that. That probably didn't even happen, if it's maybe an area of bitterness. That probably wasn't even what they meant. And so today I want to deal with these thoughts, and I would like for you to recognize that the thought gator, if I could say it that way, can destroy you if you don't stay alert. And it's one of the key issues that Jesus dealt with. I've mentioned already Matthew chapter 5. Let's go over there for a little bit here this morning. Matthew chapter 5. And I want to give you, in beginning of verse number 20, I believe, will be sort of the introduction into this passage. In verse 20, it says, "For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." And so what's he saying there? What's the point? Well, apparently the big deal was that they would do a lot of the right things. They had all the appearance outwardly, but Jesus said that inside they were like dead men's bones. It's like a sepulcher, a tomb that has been whitewashed outside. Everything looks great, but inside it's dead, smelly. And so Jesus went on by saying, you refer to the action. And understand, the actions are key, but they start on the inside. They start in our minds. And so I want us to think about this for just a moment. Jesus began dealing with these things. You say, as long as you don't do the action, it's not a problem. But I say, it's what you think about. And so let's look at it. Several that we find here in the next few verses. The first one we might refer to could be anger. Verse 22, verse 21, he says, you say, don't kill. That's the action. But I say unto you, verse 22, that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Reka, shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. What's he referring to here? It seems to be a temper issue. It's an anger issue. It's not just, oh, if you go kill them, you're wrong. But it is if you have angry and vicious thoughts about that person. If you have that thing steaming up on the inside. Murder doesn't just begin with the act of taking the life, but with the thoughts of animosity about someone. The thoughts of anger. the disposition of the mind that leads to the act. And so sometimes we need to just pause for a moment. I've encountered some of this, that we could say we're a good Christian, we could say that everything's fine, but sometimes that temper can rise up, and it can be embarrassing. They call themselves a Christian, and especially if it's somebody else, maybe you're just observing and somebody else thinks, well, wait a minute, and you know who that person is. You know that they're professing Christian, but the mind has come out into an action, and you can notice, wow, there's an anger issue there, or a temper. Obviously, you move on to the next one, and you could see one of the common ones we might think of. In verse 27, you've heard, don't commit adultery. Okay, that's the act of, I guess you could say, the act of unfaithfulness in your marriage. And there's a variety of ways we could talk about that, I suppose, but that's not my main theme. My main theme is to go a little bit further, because Jesus said in verse 28, whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. Notice that little phrase there, in his heart. We might, for our sake today, we might be able to say in the mind. That thing that you agreed with in your mind. Now, I know this might be a little bit plain this morning, but sometimes we've got to be careful, because there are things that might be dwelt on. You might say, well, I didn't actually think, I wasn't imagining that act, but you know if your thoughts were impure. And if we are imagining the wrong things, if we're allowing our mind to dwell on the wrong things, Jesus said, we're guilty just the same. The straying mind happens before the actual break in the marriage. And sometimes we have to be so careful, because there can be all sorts of things that happen that maybe we would even think, oh, well, I would never do that, but it's sort of the pet place in my mind. Jesus says, your mind's the problem. The problem, the sin begins there. Go to verse 37. We find a third one here as well. So far, we've seen it's not just murder, but it's anger. It's not just adultery, but it's unfaithfulness or impurity in your mind. Now we go to another one that's maybe not quite as obvious, and yet Jesus begins dealing with the truth. In verse 33, he's dealing with this issue, make sure you perform your vows. Don't go back on your promises. But then he says in verse 34, swear not at all. But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool. And then verse 37, let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. What I want to just talk to you for a few moments, I don't have these probably, maybe we should expand this into the whole day today to kind of deal with everything, but real quickly, one thing I think we have a danger of, a problem in our Christian society today, is a carelessness with the truth. And even though we may technically say the right thing, it was technically honest, it was technically true, our heart, our mind was deceptive. We were trying to give the wrong impression. We were trying to put on a sort of a cloak of righteousness to our deceit. And Jesus is saying, your communication ought to be just yes or no. No in between, no fuzziness, no trying to kind of deceive, even though you're real careful with your words. No, the idea is that we need to be careful to keep by the truth. I know there can be some challenges here. And I've heard a variety of things, I suppose, even in the length of my ministry. You know, sometimes even the idea that, well, if you don't answer your phone when you're holding it or you're right there, that's dishonest. I don't think we can make the phone our master, okay? Maybe many of us have without meaning to, but I don't think we can do that. But I do want us to be careful, because sometimes we just sort of fudge the issues until, in reality, we've been wrong. We've been deceptive. So how do you treat the truth? Is it yes and no? Or is it, well, if I can mislead, I'm okay with that? Honestly, we've got to be careful. We've got to be careful, because I know it can happen. It can happen very easily, that we somehow just start trying to follow the letter of the law. But our mind is deceptive. Let's move on to the fourth one quickly. And I believe that maybe we could sum up the last few verses here. Well, actually, probably about verse 38 on down through, well, maybe the end of the chapter to some extent, but at least maybe 42. And that is that we've got to be careful about a self-serving mind. A self-serving mind or selfish mind. Jesus begins dealing with it here, and he basically says, you've heard it said, the idea, maybe even the Pharisees' mindset is that as long as, if somebody hurts you first, then you can hurt them back. But Jesus said, wait a minute. You ought to have a selfless mind that even would be willing to turn the other cheek, would be willing to accept a wrong. He says here about if a man would sue you at the law, they want to take your coat. Well, let him have the cloak too. Then he says also, if probably referring to a soldier here, if the soldier would compel you to go a mile, maybe to carry the burden for a mile. Apparently a soldier was allowed to do that. He said, don't just go 1 mile, that was the law, but go 2 of them. Go beyond what the law requires. And then in verse 42, give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not away. I'm telling you, there's some nitty-gritty issues right here. It's a little bit tough sometimes. I don't think I'd want to loan my vehicle to so-and-so, or I don't think I'd want to, I'm not ready to do that. But maybe sometimes we're a little selfish. And in our minds, we might try to come up with excuses. We might come up with all these reasons. And honestly, sometimes even as it relates to the church issues and trying to help those in need, there can be some selfish motives for why we say, well, we've got to be good stewards. We've got to handle God's money wisely. But in reality, if we could really dig deep down and what the mind is saying, is that I don't like to help them. They've taken advantage of me. Or I'm not sure what they do with that. And I just, we might need that ourselves for a rainy day. I could go into some other details there, even as it relates to the church. But I better not do it. It might be a little too self-serving. And I don't mean here, I've experienced or seen some of this in the past. I will say this. Sometimes there can be those who have a pretty good handle on the money in the church, and that becomes their little nest egg. And you've got to be pretty careful when, this money is hidden. We don't report that. That's in a CD, that's for rainy day type stuff. We're not reporting that. We don't want anybody else to know about that money. Anyway, that's enough said. We've got to be honest and above board and careful. Jesus spoke of the mentality of submission and forgiveness and generosity here, and we've got to be so careful that we are not self-serving in our mind. What we're spending our time thinking. Is it service? Is it helpfulness? Is it hospitality? Or is it hoarding and greed? Is it, I just want to, take care of my stuff or myself? Now, I know we may not like to confront this reality, but most of us have probably struggled, at least at some point in our lives, with maybe most of these. Very possibly, at least one of them may be a struggle for you even right now. And again, sometimes we might talk about the mind and keeping a pure mind, but we think of it in the adultery part or the impurity part. But you go over even to what Paul said in Philippians 4 and verse 8. Let me just go there real quickly. There's a whole variety of things that the mind needs to be careful about. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. There's a whole variety of issues that we need to be careful what we're thinking about. And so God help us to have a renewed mind, one that's conformed to God's desire for us. So let me just touch on three things real quickly here. I know I've already spent probably long enough on this whole issue, but let me give you three things in closing today that I think we need to do as it relates to what Paul is giving us here in Romans 12. How do we keep our mind from getting off track? How do we make sure that our mind is renewed? Let me give you three things real quickly. First of all, I think maybe in verse 2 we could just notice the issue of asking for it. Humbly appeal for change. Notice that it says here, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. Let me just remind you, you and I cannot transform ourselves. We cannot just, there may be some steps we can take, but we can't just renew our minds by ourselves. We have to have some outside influence, you might say. We have to have God work on our souls, work on our minds, and transform us. Again, these verses are so familiar to us, many of us may kind of gloss over the transformation it's talking about here. We just kind of read through that word because some of you may have it memorized, and so we just sort of quickly gloss over it. But I want to urge you today to just kind of make sure that you give your thoughts, your mind, your heart to God for a complete transformation. We can't just resolve to do better. We have to have a transformation. God can do the work in our hearts, and so just ask Him to change your mind. Ask Him to help you to think properly. Ask Him to help you to recognize when the devil is playing on your mind. All right, that's number one. Number two, honorably activate your ability to choose. We can choose to do right. We can choose to be what God wants us to be. We can choose to govern our minds differently. So are you willing to do it? Will you honorably make the choice? I will choose right. I know it's difficult here because our minds are sort of a sneaky thing. And your mind may be 1,000 miles away before you even realize that it left. I know that may sound a little strange, but seriously, you think, whoa, wait a minute, how did I get over there? How did I start thinking about that? It can be a challenge. But we can make a choice. And as we heard down at the camp meeting, each choice we make, I'm not sure how he put it, but Brother Snyder had mentioned about the momentum that we create. If we will choose even little steps that are right, then God can help us to have, you might say, kind of get the momentum that we need to have a proper mindset. Okay? So choose the right mindset. And then not only do we need to honorably activate our choice, which, by the way, just real quick, let me just remind you, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. Okay? Don't forget that. An idle mind is the devil's workshop. Don't just allow your mind to just run, but choose. Choose to keep it in check. And then, the third one is more so in verse number 3, perhaps, where we could just maybe just be honest with ourselves for a little bit. And just honestly acknowledge the challenge that it is. Don't try to hide it. Don't try to act like, oh, I don't have any problem. My mind's always in gear. My mind's always right in track. Of course, it's always in gear, probably too. But it's right on track. It's doing it's following the right course, and I never have a temptation. Well, okay. I'm not sure I believe that. But anyway, it's right here at the end of our little section of reading here today, but it might be the first place to start. Is it just humbly acknowledge, honestly acknowledge, that, you know what? My mind quickly gets off track. And it can be a variety of things. It might be in harboring some sort of resentment about so-and-so. Or you think that they had the wrong intention, and you begin imagining things. That's part of the devil's trap for us. Maybe it is in the area of impurity, and obviously there is that issue of many times maybe what we see begins our mind thinking, and oh, Lord, help me to get my mind right back on track here. Maybe it's in some other area, as we had talked, and you start realizing that your mind is thinking up ways to deceive, particularly maybe in certain areas. I'm not saying you just sit back and think, well, how could I deceive somebody today? But maybe especially in certain areas of your life, you want everybody to think the best of you, and so you realize, I've been a little bit careless about how true to the truth I am. How careful I am, my yea being yea and my nay being nay, or my yes being yes, my no being no. All right, acknowledge the challenge. Again, you can go back there to Philippians 4:8 we read earlier, and you start reading through that. Whoa. It is a challenge. It is a challenge to always think the right things. It's hard to control those thoughts sometimes, but maybe recognizing the challenge can be helpful. And so acknowledge, just honestly acknowledge, it is a challenge, and then go back to Romans 12:2 and say, Lord, help me. Help me, renew my mind, transform my mind so that I might think the things that please you. Now, I confess, I have a lot of work to do sometimes, keeping my mind right on track, keeping it on uplifting and compassionate and selfless things, keeping it from straying off in one area or another. Honestly, this is just a petty thing maybe here, but sometimes even just on a Sunday morning, my mind can begin wandering a little bit, and, well, I wonder where so-and-so is. And, maybe I said something. Just my mind just wandering. But there could be a variety of other things, and I've had my share of battles in those areas. So we have to make sure that we let God renew our minds to show forth the acceptable and perfect will of God. It's absolutely vital. Let me go back one more scripture before I close. We have the example of the man found in Proverbs 23. Proverbs 23, and verse number 6 to begin tells us about that man, and then into verse number 7. Eat thou not the bread of him that hath an evil eye, neither desire thou his dainty meats. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, saith he to thee, but his heart is not with thee. Now, I know that's giving a warning of maybe a little different sort, but notice that principle. As he thinketh in his heart, so is he. What are your thoughts like? Is your mind really focused on the things of God? Do you allow God to really control your mind? It is so, so critical because, again, we go back to the beginning. Our thoughts control our actions. And ultimately, our actions control our destiny. Ask God to cleanse your thoughts and help you to think on things that are pure and noble and true and virtuous. Amen.